Welcome to the Balance and Brilliance podcast, a space where different perspectives and ideas converge to create powerful change. I'm your host, Terrence Hanna, serial entrepreneur and performance coach, and I'm joined by host Zoe McMahon, Fortune 100 executive and lifelong change maker. In this show, we share our complementary experiences and perspectives on topics that both propel and limit us all. We hope that by tuning in, you're able to launch yourself further with balance and brilliance. Like and subscribe to support the channel, and be sure to drop a comment below to lend your balance and brilliance to the world. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome back to Balance and Brilliance. Today we are talking part 2 on our series on change. This is a very important one, leading and driving change. Welcome back, Zoe. How's it going?
Good. And this is kind of my topic. I feel like I have been leading change in organizations in particular for my whole career. Yeah, I'm ready.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait. So why don't maybe I think starting off with like a little bit of your background in leading and driving change could be beneficial. And then maybe I think getting into a sort of a maybe a linear flow of some like processes that you use to drive change would be extremely valuable to people. And I've got a few things that I'm sure I'll be able to contribute along the way here. So over to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when I started my career, I studied environmental engineering. And I did that because I wanted to essentially influence organizations to be better stewards towards the environment. In order to do that, they would need to change from practices that were not great to better practices. And so the whole mantra of my desired career was around changing organizations. And so then I ended up doing a doctorate that was an industrial placement doctorate. And that meant I was kind of buried inside an organization, studying that organization for 4 years, observing how to change the culture of the company to be more responsive to environmental pressures and to be better for the environment overall. And so for the first 4 years, I was like a sort of ethnographer, or in the jungle. I was like studying the organization, and I never left the company. And I think those first 4 years of like watching the company and seeing what worked and how to change people's minds and views and how to change not just people's thoughts, but also processes in the company and sponsorship at the highest level, like what all of those different roles that you might have in an organization and how to achieve change at all of those different levels. Um, because I was studying that for the first 4 years, I feel like for the remaining 26, I've just been continuing to do the same thing. And so I often say that I have a sick fascination with long-term change. So I love just observing, like, oh yeah, we planted that thing over there 5 years ago, and now I can see that it's happened. So when you stick around in a place as long as I have, you get to see change happen and learn on what really works. So yeah, I feel like that's a bit of background as to how I got here. But I think one of the first things to think about when we think about changing organizations is knowing that at the end of the day you're changing people, right? There is a part of it that is about changing other things, but you're influencing the mindset of other people to do something differently than they've done it in the past. And so um
Say more. The reason I asked that, I feel like as you're talking about that, I'm really feeling a gravity of almost like an inherent responsibility that I feel goes much, much deeper than that sentence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, well, so at the end of the day, organizations are made up of people. Every decision maker in an organization is a person, and they have a certain amount of freedom to like or not like or agree or disagree with what you're trying to get them to do. And I think maybe one of the things that I want to add at this point, of course, change in organizations can be very tops down, it could be very limited freedoms or whatever. But the kind of change I'm talking about is more influencing change, without authority, as opposed to authority oriented change, which of course would have a different kind of mode to it. But
Now
when
you're
you're in,
talking language. You're talking the difference between being a leader versus being a boss.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So when you're influencing people, you're it's inevitably influencing their thinking, right, around certain things. And what I found early on is that there are going to be some people who resonate with what you're trying to do, and they may inherently agree with the change that you're trying to make. And so let's call that on the one hand. And then you've got other people who aren't motivated by the same things that you're motivated by, but they'll be motivated by something. So, for example, if they're in their role and they care about, um, you know, driving revenue profitability or something for the company, if they can kind of buy into the idea that what we're doing can be viewed that way, then they'll buy into the change. But another person might be like, no, I just want to do it because it's good for the environment. And I'll be like, great. And so I would find that as we were trying to influence people, being super flexible about, um, well, it can help this, but it can also help that, would secure like more people's mindsets and sort of speaking their language, if you like. So to get as many people on side, sometimes you would have to twist the message a little bit. But so I
A
think
broad,
I think a lot
you're
of things about hearts and minds and also wallets.
So I think what you're talking about here is offering to the stakeholders a broader portfolio of benefit.
Hmm.
Okay. Something else that you said in there that, going back in my experience in leading change, first you need the why. The what are we changing and why do we need to change it? But in that why is the opportunity to create the sense of urgency in that change. And that's something that you had just briefly touched on. And I'd love to get more out of you on that aspect of things, the creating the urgency, the creating the additional benefits within the offering to the stakeholders.
Mm. Well, it's really appealing to values, like I said, and motivations and what people want to get out of it. But fortunately, I was never one to, let's talk about the carrot and the stick, right? You can create urgency with both approaches. And I've never been particularly stick in style. You know, a lot of the issues that I would be driving change in would stem from regulatory change, for example. So if we now had to do something that we didn't have to do before, there's a penalty for not doing it. Right. So you could take a very sort of stick oriented approach and say, well, if we don't do this thing, we're going to get fined, we're going to get investigated, we're going to get complaints. And you could use that kind of urgency, use the stick to drive that urgency. Like, no, we got to get this done because there's going to be some negative consequences if we don't. I tended to I tended to prefer methodologies around driving value that, the regulation is sure that's the law, but there are other reasons why this is a good thing to do. So I always wanted to appeal to people's sense of desire and wanting and positivity because I felt like they would be more willing to change. And so you create the urgency through kind of created patterns of desire that they want to follow, as opposed to me trying to force something onto them. So I tend to be more that style.
So in your experience, I mean, there's study after study of the effectiveness of leadership versus bossing. In your experience, doing this on a large scale, very big company, many stakeholders from many disciplines involved. Give me a little bit more on that aspect of things.
Yeah. Um, I'm probably so surrounded by these that I'm not even able to identify them, but I'll give it a shot. So I'll give you an example that's not to do with environmental things, but a couple of years ago, a leader decided that we were going to implement a platform, a technology platform to do certain things. But they failed to really connect with the organization on what the reason was, right? Why we needed to have this platform. They just had a passion for it. They just wanted to drive change. They wanted to drive efficiency, but they never really connected with the stakeholders properly in a change management sense, and never really had a compelling articulation of the value that they wanted to get out of the change. And so to this day, we're kind of left tweaking this solution and trying to make it work and trying to convince ourselves because it was never done properly at the beginning. And I would call that an example of a kind of tops down change where it just didn't work because of the lack of preparation and forethought that goes into it. And I'm pretty surgical when I think about driving change. I think about um, very precisely sort of where is the value going to come from and going very strategic, kind of going after those ideas as
Mhm.
opposed to kind of a blanket, oh, this is generally speaking a good idea. That's very hard to get people on side. But if we can be very pointed in the value that's going to be created and then get people on side towards that, I think it's important. Which kind of I want to pick up on something that we mentioned in the last episode, which was about this idea of change having a sort of rider and a an elephant and a path, and that the elephant being the kind of emotional energy around the way we're currently doing it versus the rational brain going, yeah, I understand why we need to do this thing, but the emotional energy of being stuck sort of where we are and having a clear sense of where we want to go. If you don't address that elephant, it will not move. And I think in the example that I was just giving you, there wasn't a compelling enough, A, there wasn't a compelling enough rational reason, but B, there was no attempt to shift the emotional energy in the room towards the new space. So I think that's really important to acknowledge the inertia of the current way that things are happening and people's attachment to them.
I think too, like what you're talking about right now is actually very applicable regarding the time frames that you would set to implement said change. So for instance, if you are pushing an elephant that doesn't want to move in the sense of this is going to be a difficult change for you as an individual or a team, you need to allow significantly more time for adoption of the mindset just due to the nature of the resistance. But I think, and this comes back largely to establishing a clear vision and then communicating that vision. If people see or at least perceive that inherent benefit in this difficult change in a way that they can immediately get behind it, that just drastically shortens
Mm-hmm.
the time frame that's required. So from I think at that point, that's where it really ties back to leadership in how these changes are being communicated and then in
Mm-hmm.
turn implemented. And a large part of that, at least in my experience, and I'd love to get your take on this, boils back to what we were talking about again in the previous episode regarding autonomy. Um, I had a phenomenal discussion with somebody one day, and I remember them saying to me, give people the power to create your reality. And that was very, that to me again is the somebody saying, hey, this is this vision that we have, and you have amazing skills that can help make this happen, and I would love for you to work with us on this. That's a hell of a lot different than saying we need this, go build it.
Mm. It's super interesting because I think when I started out in my career, I didn't have that. I didn't have that wisdom. I think nowadays, I think the concept of, you know, you don't want to be better than everybody under you. You want people that you're trying to change and influence to be better than you so that you give them the power to do that. Like that wasn't part of my dictionary in the early stages of my career or mindset. It wasn't there yet. So I think that's really interesting. But I think there's another interesting concept, which is in a in an organization as opposed to a set of individuals. And this might even apply in your Web3 space. So I'd be curious to hear in a second. But there's a cultural component that when you're in a group setting, there it has its own identity. So where often we talk about individual identities being rocked when we talk about change, in organizational terms, it also has a sort of identity. And organizations have distinct cultures for sure. And so one of the things that early on that was useful for me was attaching kind of what I was trying to do to some cultural hook in the organization. Like, okay, we know that as a group we like X. Like, let's say we had a cultural identity around community, our responsibility to community. Okay, we've said that that's what we are about. All right, I'm now going to use that to drive what I need. I'm going to call it, I'm going to frame it as part of that, legitimizing what I'm trying to do in the terms that the organization has already said is part of its identity. And so it's very hard for people to resist, right? If, oh, yeah, we want to be like that, so we'll do this. And so I found that particularly helpful. I don't know if that is there a culture in the Web3 world that you've been leading change in, or does that resonate in that context?
Very much so. Honestly, one thing that I'll say regarding that aspect of things is I think we were remarkably successful in the Web3 space while we were doing Friends Radio and driving that change. There was some tremendous learning experiences that came out of that, and I'm excited to get into that in a little bit about how, there's been some shifting and changes around that, and I'm looking forward to getting into that. Um, some regarding the culture though, something that I think is really interesting about what you said that is sort of ringing in the back of my mind is this culture, fostering this culture of of embracing change and innovation, really boiling it down to the end of the day is fostering a culture of innovation. That's a groundwork that needs to be laid long before a change happens. That's about structuring the culture of a group that you're engaging in so that that change is welcome. Some, in order for leaders, I think, to effectively employ these types of strategies, this is something that needs to be there from the beginning, or at least very long before this major change comes into play. I think that if there is a culture of that's kind of gone away from that, and then there's immediate change that happens, managing that circumstance becomes exponentially more difficult. And
Right.
this kind of goes back to the value prop you were talking about of all of this in culture. So
Yeah.
yeah, I thought I had that down as something I wanted to discuss from my experience that I thought would be beneficial. Oh, we got a guest.
All right, I'll just go close the door. Thank you. Right.
I remember when I was doing an episode of Friends Radio one time, we had like hundreds of people in the space, and my son walked into the room and was talking about how he messed his pants. And I don't actually think anybody heard it, but in that moment
Yeah, so tell me more about your what you were this culture change or innovation changes that you were leading.
well, I think a big one, you know, the one that I would say stands out most to me was my experience in the Web3 space. And I think that was really driving a sense of community, and giving people a home And what I mean by giving people a home, and I think this is a big, again, in my experience, is a massive part of leading and driving change, is people need to be comfortable with the idea. If they can, go home and kick their shoes off and comfortably sit in the concept of what's happening,
Mm,
that's very, very powerful, very powerful.
mm.
And so in the Web3 sense, that's something that I think we did extremely well. I think a lot of people were um, in it for quick gains and high volatility and a plethora of other reasons, community certainly being one of them. But I think what we did was we really brought community to the forefront uh, while we were doing that, and it was a remarkable experience.
Yeah, I
And
really like that because that was kind of creating that culture, that community that you had now has an identity to it, right? It has a feeling to it. And so now that you have that, if you tried to introduce something that didn't fit with that, it would be kind of like, that doesn't work because we came here for this, right?
Mhm,
And so I think these ideas of group identity are very interesting. I also think that in organizations, there was an interesting effect that you'd think something like environmental issues or human rights issues, you'd think they would have like universal appeal and everyone would be like, sure, let's get on board, right? Like, why wouldn't they get on board to your point about creating that why around why we change and getting everyone on board? But when you're in a business setting, bit like your listeners kind of wanting that short-term gains and volatility. Sometimes people in a business setting, they hang their values up at the door, right? They're like, yeah, I care about the environment, but I'm at work now, right? And
mhm,
I'm motivated by different things when I'm in this work setting. And so I was surprised how often, we had to appeal to those different vectors, that something that would even be seemingly obvious
mhm.
and easy to resonate with people didn't always. And so because everybody's different,
Yeah.
and again, when we join organizations, we kind of drop our personal identity and start becoming in part of that club.
Well, and I think this goes back to something, and like I say, in my experience in doing that, I think we did so many things right. And I think there was some incredible learning opportunities and takeaways from that. And what I'll say with that is in that particular circumstance, due to a plethora of reasons we don't need to get into right now, there was some pivots and shifts that were required in the business model. Um, and that raised and presented an entirely new set of challenges, right? So I think the adaptability, like what we're talking about right now, in there's there's sort of a flow that's required to it, and this is, again, massive learning opportunities for me as an individual. But I think when you're building the house, for lack of a better word, that we had talked about, the home,
Mm,
it needs to be mobile. And what I mean by that is, if you are, and again, you know what, actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, I think that this may apply differently to different circumstances. But I think that in fostering a culture of innovation, like we had talked about, there's some natural mobility to what you're trying to achieve, right? So I think, building the monolith, if you will, I think, presents, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, because change is inevitable, right? So if
mm-hmm,
you build this monolith that is incapable of change, it will
mm-hmm.
inevitably fail, because
Yes,
change always happens. So
yes.
that was kind of a long-winded way of saying that, but I do think it was important, and there's some major learning takeaways there for me as an entrepreneur, um, that
It
were
reminds me of
invaluable.
something. It really reminds me of something that there was another paradox when ultimately in an organization, when you're trying to change something, you're trying to make it part of how things happen naturally, or how things, the default mode, if you like, of the organization.
Mhm.
That's what you're trying to do. And so that, oh, it's automatic for whatever you're trying to get done happens now. So at the beginning, the change agents, we're trying to sell the change, right? We're trying to create this, establish this normal behavior. And so imagine at some point in the cycle that change is like, oh yeah, now we know how to do that. That's normal now. And so the need for the change agents goes away. But as soon as the change agents go away, people start forgetting that it was important. And so you get back this cycle again of like, no, 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 we need the change agents again to kind of to keep going forwards. But if you create this structure of permanence around the change agents kind of just constantly doing something, it actually doesn't work. I think you have to have these ebbs and flows of what is relevant in the organization at different times. And actually, I think this is something that I um, was thinking about. I come across a concept apparently it's a military concept called OODA loops. Are you familiar with OODA loops?
No.
So it's a strategic military planning framework that you can be used in any learning context where you need agility, right? Where you need to kind of be responsive to what's going on, because as you just said, change is constant. When you're driving change, you have to remember that the context is going to change with you. And so OODA loops is uh, observe what's going on around you and orient yourself, and then make decisions and then act. And so every time at every step, you've also got a feedback loop back to observe. So you're constantly like looking at the signals of what's actually happening in the organization, constantly reorienting to what's needed, and then decide what to do and then act. Constant feedbacks of learning. And so I think when it comes to driving change in organizations, what worked in year one isn't going to work in year two, because
Absolutely.
you've had change in the system and you now need to reorient yourself to what's needed next. And that sounded a bit similar to what you were talking about.
No, I love what the reference that you made to the back and forth of the ebb and flow. My brain automatically just goes to the pendulum effect, which is, that something that we all deal with. But to that point, actually, you know, it's kind of funny because in this series, something that I really wanted to do was to look at things from a perspective of the individual as well as the leadership team, or the leadership structure. But in this, obviously, we're talking about the leading and the driving of change. So much more of this boils back to the leadership and the culture that's being developed. And something to this point of the ebb and flow or the pendulum effect is, the ability to provide continual and adaptive resources, right? Sometimes it may be capital, sometimes it may be compassion, and having that natural ebb and flow and that adaptability as a leader, I think, is extremely important.
Mm. Hmm. I I think that's right. And this is what I'm about to say is kind of a classic management, I don't know, like thing. It's like never let a crisis go to waste, right? So,
When there's blood in the streets, buy property.
well, I mean, I go, you said that. I've done it myself, So, for example, if you're trying to advance a certain agenda, and there's a crisis that pertains to that exact thing that you can build on to drive change, you've created that sense of urgency again. So sometimes what it takes to create the change you're looking for isn't what you thought it would be. And so sometimes you can capitalize on those opportunities, right, that come up, like the crises, be like, oh, okay, I'm going to go and use that method instead. I think another thing that I've really enjoyed observing is kind of the idea that every idea has its day. But sometimes what you're trying to do is maybe not right this week, month, year, but getting so far with it, you can maybe observe that at some point later, when conditions were right, it actually happened, and that it wasn't a bad idea. It's just that the moment wasn't right for that idea to happen, and I've loved seeing that.
I think that can be a very difficult experience to go through too. And again, in my own experience, I couldn't agree more with that, right? You and I had a discussion previously, around using sort of baking as like an analogy, right? And if you have that loaf of dough or loaf of dough, if you have that ball of dough and you chuck it in the oven at an inappropriate time, the result of the bread that it yields is going to be significantly different than if it, you know, that may be a bit of a loose analogy, but I think it's something that's relevant, and you and I have discussed in the past. And um,
Well, and maybe on that, building on that with my analogy of every day, every idea has its day, you can be more passive about that and kind of just say, okay, well, it's obviously not the right time for this idea to permeate. Or maybe you can think, what are the conditions that would be needed for this idea to permeate? And how can I go around creating those conditions
yeah.
if this isn't working, right? So I think that is the more kind of opportunistic view, is really recognizing what it would take.
So yeah, something else just building on that I think is incredibly important, just as the performance coach side of things, is if you're gonna sit back and you're gonna say to yourself, now's not the right time, you need to set the conditions for what is the right time. So, there's a difference between planning and procrastination, right? So I think that when you say, now's not the right time for this because of X, Y, Z conditions, and when these conditions are met, then it's the right time. That's the formulation of a strategic plan, as opposed to now's not the right time. That's not a plan. That's just pushing it off down the road, in my opinion.
Yeah, and this is why I really like that OODA loop thing, because and it comes from the concept of military strategy, exactly right. Because if you're taking that space to plan based off of observation, then yeah, you're being strategic about what might need to happen. And I absolutely love the concept of identifying when the right time would be. I don't think people do that enough. I think we tend to try something, give up, try something, and not sort of take that step back and figure out what it would take to make this happen.
Well, I think this goes back to setting, as in the coaching world, there's in order to set a goal, it needs to be a SMART goal. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. So this last portion of this is the time bound aspect of that, right? If you're pushing it off without setting the conditions for it to come to fruition, it will never come to fruition, or at least it, maybe it will, but it's certainly not a plan.
Yeah, I think there's another analogy since you're talking about SMART goals. Is when we think about individuals setting goals for themselves in coaching, for example, there's a connection between that and habits, right? In terms of moving towards those goals in is establishments of habits based off of what you want to get to. And I think the same thing applies in organizations, but it's less talked about. So I'll give you an example. I've seen cases in leadership environments where they have a emotional, let's say, or an aspirational intention around more adopting digital transformation. Let's just use as an example that this is an aspiration that this whole leadership team has. And yet, in every meeting that they have, they don't talk about it because they're talking about all of their individual things that are important to them. This thing that is collectively important to them is often put to the side because they're all focused on their individual gains. And sometimes the habit of just doing that Like I'm going to be motivated by I'm in the finance department, I'm driven by certain things, or I'm in marketing, I'm driven by certain things. Unless you create the space and time to actually do things differently. If we want to talk about digital transformation, we have to create space in the group agenda to actually talk about it. And so often I've seen us, in companies have aspirations, but not actually create the space to act on. And it's like healthy habits, right? It's like you have to create the habit of doing it, replacing something else that you were doing before. And I think that's not, organizational habits are not talked about as much, but I think there's a real parallel. Well, when Terry and I set out to make this episode, we were both very keen on the topic. So keen, we kept going for quite a bit longer than usual. So to help our audience absorb the lessons we shared, we decided to pause this first part of our episode and give you this halftime recap. In this episode, Terry and I go back and forth with our different experiences of driving change as leaders and coaches. As it unfolded, it evolved into a series of lessons or key success factors for driving change. Here are the lessons that we learned up to this point. Fundamentally, change is about influencing people. Decisions in organizations and other contexts are made by people, so winning their hearts and minds is the key. When you are trying to influence people or organizations to change, particularly without authority, adopting the perspective of a leader versus a boss is important. This requires listening, getting buy-in, and communicating the change to people in their language. To truly get that buy-in, people need to be empowered, or as Terry put it, given the power to create your reality. As you go about trying to motivate change, being flexible in your approach is necessary. Being able to present a broad portfolio of benefits to a wide audience will achieve greater adoption. Having a clear articulation of the needs and urgency of change is also important. Knowing when to lean on carrot versus stick approaches in defining the why can be helpful. In addition to any rationale for change that will appeal to people's sense of logic, change also requires shifting the emotional elephant, as described in the change management book, Switch. In organizations, there can also be a group identity or culture to navigate, and it can be beneficial to both use that existing culture to your advantage and to create the cultural conditions for innovation or change to be successful. The change also has to feel good and right for people. If they can go home and comfortably sit with the concept of what is happening, the commitment is more likely. Again, as change proceeds, it's important to recognize the need for adaptability and agility. As change progresses, needs change. Constantly taking a step back and reorienting to what is happening and tackling the change strategically from there is a great practice. Being responsive is needed in mindset and planning, but also in resource allocation. This even includes capitalizing on crises or opportunities as they arise. Responsive also means that every idea can have its day, but it's not always the day that you think it will be. This might be challenging initially, but if you can ask yourself what the conditions for success are, you can strike while the iron is hot another time. Having this what would it take mindset can help set the right time frame for a smart change goal. Finally, at least for now, during the change process, it's important to set the right habits in motion. And this is as true for organizations as it is for people. If something is important, make a point of talking about it often. Persistence pays in realizing change. Well, with that laundry list of tips, that's where we'll leave it for now. If you enjoyed this journey, do check out the second half of this one, where we focus on feedback loops, adoption curves, trust, and more human relationship factors in driving change successfully. Thank you so much for listening, and do check out the next one. Thank you.